Today we're going to be talking about mastering the plains. The Great Plains, which is what we're talking about here, is right in the middle of the country. Remember, we talked about in last year in US 1, the regions. We have coastal plain, Appalachian Mountains, interior lowlands, and then we come to the Great Plains, and that is right before the Rocky Mountains. This is an area that is very, very flat. It's very dry. Very little rainfall happens here. So little, in fact, that the first explorers, people that came through and saw the Great Plains, would call it the Great American Desert. As we see here by this person that passed through the Great Plains in 1853, said that there was no water, no grass, nothing but barren hills, broken rocks, sand, and dust. That sounds like a desert to me. And so this is the type of land that we're looking at in the Great Plains. But Mr. Guzzi, you said that this is the breadbasket of America. We make a lot of our food there. It's very fertile, and that is true today, but not back then. And so when we're looking at the Great Plains, when we first started moving out there, it was cold, dusty, soil didn't look good. Nobody wanted it, which is why it's probably so easy for us to obtain and then just go out there. People just didn't want the land. Nobody was really contesting it, and so we were able to have it. Well, let's make sure that we get our vocabulary word in: perception, becoming aware of, understanding something by using one's senses. So that's what we're talking about here with the Great Plains, is that the perception is going to change massively. It's going to turn from a wasteland, the Great American Desert, to now America's breadbasket. How is that going to take place? How did we basically turn a desert into some of the most fertile land in America? Um, Plain and simple, American ingenuity, we like to say. A lot of There was very little rainfall. Most of the rain would come from the Rocky Mountains through the rivers, and so people had to be creative with how they were going to farm this land. So let's take a look at. There's two basic categories here of how we're going to look at this. The first is the inventions. We're going to have four inventions here, and then four adaptations. So adaptations when you're adapting to something, when um, it's raining outside, so you adapt by going inside or covering your head with your jacket or getting an umbrella. Inventing would be inventing the umbrella or um, inventing some way to a rain jacket so that you don't get wet. So we're going to use this worksheet here to write down our answers to how people invented their way and adapted their way through the very harsh terrain and turned it into very fertile land. So the first thing here is the barbed wire. Because there was very little water out there, trees could not grow. Grass could. Um, in spite of what that lady just said in the other quote, grass grew very well in the Great Plains. The water did come through the Great Plains, mostly in those rivers that we talked about coming out of the Rocky Mountains. But trees had a tough time. They need sustained water. And so, since there's no trees, how do you make a fence? Well, we invented something called a barbed wire. And some of you may be familiar with a chicken wire, barbed wire. This is a way to fence in something without using wood. So you get a couple of stakes of wood, you bang them into the ground, and then you tie barbed wire around it, and that becomes your fence. So that's how people were able to keep their cattle from roaming around. That's how they mark their territory, is by using barbed wire, and that's because not too many trees were around. And then we're going to go to the steel plow. John Deere, you may be familiar with the company John Deere, but there was a real person. John Deere was an Illinois blacksmith, and he invents instead of a cast iron plow, he invents a polished steel. um, and it was sharper, better. Uh, the ground is very dry in the Great Plains, and so you need something that's sharp and very strong to get through that type of land so that you can prepare it for crops. And so this, John Deere, obviously very famous, somebody very successful, was able to invent this steel plow that was able to get through the very hard, almost rocky terrain and make it usable. The next thing is the windmills. Midwest has abundant wind. We see this in Texas. In fact, they had some problems a little while ago because their windmills froze and they lost power. But back then, windmills were used to pump water out from underground aquifers. You see, the water is under the ground. You just dig deep enough. That's why people make wells. There's water down there. And so, in order to get the water to come up and be able to put onto your crops, you need these windmills. And so we invent these windmills and place them out into the west, and they're able to pull the water up so that it's usable for these farms. When you have flat land, the wind is going to move around all the time, and so it was fairly reliable in this area. And then finally, the railroads, and we talked a little bit about it last time. Railroads are able to, since we have all this gold being found out in the Sierra Nevadas and California, all these railroads are being built across the United States. And so, because these railroads don't just jump over the Great Plains, they go through the Great Plains. And so, all along the way, you're going to see these places that are railway stops going all the way out to the West Coast. And so, people are able to transport their crops much more easily. They're able to transport goods from out east over into the Great Plains, and so the railroads make life much easier for people that are moving out west. Now, adaptations. This is the real interesting part, and let's move down here to our adaptation. The first one we're going to look at is dry farming. This type of farming is used in areas with little rainfall. The farmers in the fall stirred up the soil before planting. Remember the steel plow. They used drought-resistant crops, crops that don't need as much water or as consistent water. And then they topped it with mulch. We use a lot of mulch around here to make sure that the soil stays a certain way. The mulch uses soil's natural moisture to help crops grow. So it keeps that moisture in there and allows the crops to hold on to the moisture instead of just evaporating and disappearing into thin air. All right, so the next one is sod houses. Now, remember we talked about there's no trees or very few trees out in the Great Plains. And so people had to make sod houses. These are basically mud huts. They take the ground, grass, and they start making these. You can see a little bit here, and then right here. This is very little wood is used in these houses. They make these basically mud bricks, and then they take grass and just put it on top. Grass holds the dirt together very well and is able to deflect a lot of the rainfall that they would get and protect their roofs by having these grass roofs. So they used the soil to make these bricks. They kind of like the adobe bricks, but instead of clay, they're using dirt. And these were not great houses. They could be destroyed fairly easily. But what were you supposed to do? To import wood would be very, very expensive, and these people are starting with nothing. So they're going to make these dirt grass huts to survive out there. It's what they had to do. It's how they adapted. Another one is instead of having crops, they raised cattle. Uh, think about it. The grasslands, it's the only thing that's really growing out there. What likes grass? Cattle. And so people would take their cattle out there and make more cattle and raise beef. One thing that, we like our barbecue out here, and usually people have pork. But if you go out west, you go to Texas, their barbecue is beef. They use beef, and that's because they have lots of cows out there. And so they raise beef on these grasslands, and that's one way that they're able to get around the very difficult land. Instead of farming, why not just raise cattle? And then finally, wheat farms. Wheat, if you look at grass when it grows very tall, it almost looks like wheat. And so wheat and grass are very similar. And so, and this is a great crop to have for food. And so, with all this land out there, people are able to grow wheat, and so that's what they do. The plains were a great environment for growing cereal grains like rye, wheat, barley, and oats. And that's why we call it the America's breadbasket. Wheat turns into bread, and so we grow so much wheat out there and so much food. But I guess people just didn't really think it was possible until we had to move out there and try to make a go of it. And this is how people adapted. And now, instead of a desert or unusable land, we now have America's breadbasket in the Great Plains.